Welcome to our sixth IBA Stage event of the year. For those of you less familiar with the series, IBA Stage is a series in which invited biennials have a chance to deliver a presentation of their more recent project. The series was developed very much as a response to the impossibility of traveling during the height of the COVID pandemic, but we kept it as a sort of as part of our public program. As we thought it would continue to be a great tool to create lasting archive of biennials across the world for our members and those interested in the wider biennial community. I will quickly go through a few basic house rules for the event before introducing our speakers. And first of all, I want to remind you that the event is recorded and also currently streamed through our social media outlets. So let me also take a minute to welcome those who are following us, not here through the Zoom, but through other channels. Welcome. As basic rules, I want to remind you that if you wish to speak, please use the raise your hand function in the Zoom application and refrain to doing so during the presentation itself, but keep your questions for the Q&A session at the end of it. If you want to type any questions in the chat during the presentation, you're welcome to do so, and we will read them when we start the Q&A session. Apologies for that. And during the presentation itself, we ask you to keep your microphone and your camera off, but you're more than welcome to turn your camera on as soon as the Q&A session starts. And lastly, if you have any questions or comments that you wish to address us as IBA, you're more than welcome to do so at info@biennialassociation.org, both about the event today and about other series of our public program. Thank you for listening to this long list of house rules, but we're all used to the Zoom format, but it's good to remind everyone of how to behave in a way that assures the best dialogue possible. Let me then introduce the two guests that we have today with us here on IBA Stage. Barbara Moore, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Biennale of Sydney and a colleague here at IBA, where she was elected as a board member in December 2021. Prior to her appointment as CEO, she spent 8 years leading the Biennials development team, rallying support for the arts in events through Australian and international governments and so on. She has a background in fine arts, which she acquired at Emily Carr's University in Vancouver, and further studies in management in Australia. She is currently a member of the Australian federal government's Creative Economy Task Force and a member of the Australian Institute for Companies Director. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to hear about the 23rd Biennial of Sydney, but also about the Biennial's general history and your role in it. Second guest, just in order of in alphabetical order, is Jose Roca. Jose Roca is a Colombian curator who was artistic director of the 23rd Biennale of Sydney, titled Rivus. He also runs Flora Ars Natura, an independent space for contemporary art in Bogota. And he was Estrellita Brodsky adjunct curator for Latin American art at Tate Modern between 2012 and 2015. He managed for a decade the arts program at the Banco de la República MAMO in Bogota, and has an extensive knowledge and experience in the field of biennial, having curated or co-curated about 9, I think we counted just before this stream started. I will just name a few of them. The first polygraphic triennial in San Juan in Puerto Rico, the 27th Biennale Sao Paulo in Brazil, the Encuentro de Medellin in 2007, Filográfica in 2012, which is the Philadelphia International Triennial for print in contemporary arts, and the 8th Biennale du Mercosur in Porto Alegre in 2011. As said, this is just a glimpse of his experience in biennials, but we are here to focus on his most recent work during the Biennale of Sydney last year, or earlier this year, I should say. And without spending much more time of anyone, I would give you both the words. And I think Barbara wants to start this presentation. Thank you very much both for being here. I know that you're both on different time zones, and it's not easy to take part of these events, especially if we are in different time zones, but I really appreciate, and I think we all appreciate as part of the International Biennial Association, that you're here presenting Rivus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Jennifer, too, who is helping out on the back end from IBA. I just want to start by acknowledging country, the traditional owners of where I'm joining you from, the Gadigal people. And I acknowledge them, saltwater people, coastal people, traditionally got a lot of the sustenance from the ocean that I'm staring at right outside my window. Well, I'd see more if it was daylight, but it's quite dark now. And recognize the Gadigal people's continued connection to land, water, culture, all of its country, all of it. And pay my respects to the elders, and a particular welcome to any and all First Nations people joining us today. All right, quick overview of format. Well, first I'm going to say, look, for those who aren't maybe accustomed to that kind of an acknowledgement, the reason why it's important, certainly here, is because for 250 years it hadn't been done. Yeah, so consider it a bit of a healing or a shift, a reshift, decent shift on understanding of place. So when we're talking about arts and culture, particularly in this place, when I'm among the longest continuous living culture in the world, the starting point is First Nations, certainly in this place anyway. So thank you all for joining us. Quick format. I'm going to start with 10 minutes on a quick and dirty overview of the Biennale of Sydney to give you a bit of context and lead up into Rivus, which the artistic direction was led by Jose Roca, the gorgeous Jose, incredible human being, best curator. It's not supposed to be a plug for if you wanted to work with an amazing curator, go with Jose. I'll hand over to him, and then I'll wrap up really quickly, not even 5 minutes, 2 minutes at the end to see where that placed us. So 10 for me, a decent 15 for him. All right, so let me share my screen, and here we go. This is what we're talking about, Rivus from the Biennale. So first, I'll start by saying Biennale of Sydney, it's one of the oldest, one of the eldest and longest running biennales in the world. We present in museum and non-museum venues, or what I like to call as public spaces, across Sydney and the greater Sydney area, once every 2 years for 3 months. Where we all started, and again, I'm not going to give you a history lesson. There we go. Okay, not going to give you a history lesson on the Biennale of Sydney, but to give you context, we started 50 years ago. So a month after the Sydney Opera House, a pretty iconic building in Australia, opened to the public, the Biennale of Sydney activated that space. So we were in Sydney Opera House from the 23rd of November, 1973. Yep, coming up to 50 years. And the impetus, they were Italian immigrants who came to Australia. They wanted a Venice Biennale. They grew up with a Venice Biennale, they wanted one, but wanted to shed that country-specific pavilion model and instead lean into what are the things happening around the world, what stories need to be told. It's from a philanthropic point and a love for art and contemporary ideas, not for tourism. So it was very much for a local community. There was a lot of immigration at the time, and it was the idea to present work that people could relate to and see themselves in the work. And at the time, those immigrants certainly couldn't. So Franco Belgione-Nedes is our founder. That's where we start. Now, again, if you want a decent history spiel on the Biennale of Sydney, we have a pretty rich archive, so you can go hard online. But I'm going to start to give you an intro of my entry point. So my relationship with the Biennale of Sydney started 15 years ago. It started with Carolyn Christoph Barkagiev's Biennale in 2007. I was working at the Canadian consulate at the time, and I just arrived to Australia with a love, passion, complete background in the visual arts. And this major blockbuster model of a Biennale was my first intro. So this is a work by Pierre Hoy, again at the Sydney Opera House, cleared out the concert hall, a very traditional space, and presented a forest. 24 hours, anyone could go in and walk through a forest in the middle of what people normally thought as a performance space. That was, I guess you can say, my first intro. Well, not first intro, but first participation. I was raising a lot of money for that exhibition. Next, David Elliott. This is Saigo Kwang's, you may know this work from a couple of collections, but this is the second edition that was on Cockatoo Island in the middle of Sydney Harbor, a huge island, huge industrial wasteland place with a rich, rich history of, Australia all clobbered together in one location. Rock star curator, rock star artists, major works. Let's call it maximalism. Now, when I started working at the Biennale of Sydney, it was 2011. So the artistic directors were Gerald McMaster and Catherine de Zegher. Gerald McMaster was the first First Nations artistic director of the Biennale, apart from Hetty Perkins, who was part of the curatorium in 2000. He was Canadian. This is the work by Tiffany Singh, and I'm showing it because it's just this, it was a shift from like that blockbustery type model to looking at parts of the world that might have been overlooked or could have kind of a deep, meaningful engagement. So yeah, that was my first, when a shift was certainly happening. Now, when I started as CEO, fast forward to 2019, it was 9 months before Nearin, the 2020 Biennale of Sydney, opened to the public, which was curated by Brooke Andrew, which is only the second time an artist had been invited to curate the Biennale of Sydney. Nearin is a Wiradjuri word, it means edge, and this exhibition was all about changing the perception of edge, where people might consider something as edge, that edge is actually somebody else's center. This exhibition was First Nations led and artist led. Again, a major shift for this exhibition, for this organization, and really moreover the country, how to center First Nations voices. The Biennale of Sydney had included work by Aboriginal artists in our editions for 44 years, but there's that old line of inclusion is exclusion. It's not about including it, it's about looking at this from like a proper kind of community consultation perspective, how to truly empower individuals to do their best work and share their stories in a safe place. These are works by Nongana Mirawili. So these are, let's say, very traditional Yolngu paintings where everything is found on country. So you'd never see this work on canvas, for example. It's all bark paintings where everything used to create this is found on country. And that's celebrated in Brooke's exhibition in 2020. You also look at works from his edition like Tony Albert, which is a completely different thing from that kind of traditional object exhibition making process. Tony Albert's project was very community-based. He's looking at kind of a replantation of native plants, working with kids to kind of learn and heal country. So his practice is less like something that you can walk into and see as an object. There was that component, but it's much more experiential. So Brooke's exhibition was pushing the lines between public programming and proper and exhibition. So much about community projects. Now, the most important part of my role as CEO, it says it in big letters at the top of my job description, is to support the vision of the artistic director. And the thing is, the Biennale, it's built to be responsive, it's built to be adaptive and open to change. That's our responsibility with creativity and with care. So when different ideas come up, we lean into them. We're not an institution. We work with major galleries and museums to help kind of implement that change. Let's say the Biennale is the provocation to take certain risks And then if it works out, those can be embraced. And if it doesn't, well, we move on, and kind of no harm, no foul. In that way, I just want to highlight that the Biennale of Sydney, it's not a biennial exhibition of contemporary art. It presents a biennial event with an exhibition of contemporary art at its core, but it is a provocation. It brings people together to talk about and think about what's happening right now in the world, celebrating and appreciating contemporary art, and really giving agency to artists to tell their own stories. So right before I hand over to Jose, I want to emphasize that, you know, it's one of my favorite lines lately, but it's that biennales don't start and stop, they flow. That there is no next from an organizational perspective, from the people who are involved in the exhibition making's perspective. It's a flow. There's an overlap and an ongoing, a continuing moving from one to the other. It's all connected. So there were things we learned from Niren and from the previous editions that weren't done yet, that needed to be teased out, that Jose wanted to, let's say, get out of his system or resonated for us, like, you know, the state of our planet, an environmental consciousness in exhibition making, and a First Nations focus, a transparency and accountability about process. Final thing, Jose, just to mention that you were appointed in February 2020, right after the fires across Australia, or during the major fires across Australia, before COVID was really a thing. We were still oblivious to the mass challenges that COVID were all going to have on our lives, and how we genuinely thought about exhibition making. Then the world shuttered. The Biennale was scrambling around to present the 2020 edition. We opened for 10 days, we closed, we extended our dates, we moved exhibitions. It was a lot. There was a distinct moment in July 2020 when Jose and I, you know, had a scheduled Zoom call where both of us knew the conversation we were going to have before we had it, which was, are we going to do this as planned in 2022, or are we going to move to 2023? I spoke about it with the board, and from the Biennale of Sydney's perspective, it's like, this is an exhibition that only happens once every 2 years. If we can't do it, come what may, for 2 years, you know, what are we doing? So we went for it. But, you know, this Biennale was largely produced online, of working online. We wanted and we needed something joyous to look forward to at the end of this tunnel of 2020 and 2021, to bring people together and feel something again. It had its challenges. It felt like every time we tried to host a patron event, things got shut down. Australia had firm international border restrictions, but we were largely unvaxxed. So we were living in a bit of a bubble. Well, that came crashing down in 2021. We went into a lockdown, which was pretty tough on all of us mentally. I posted on Instagram, it was 100 days in lockdown. I was becoming decreasingly disheveled. But Jose moved to Sydney to be completely embedded in the community here to deliver this exhibition. He moved 1.5 years before it opened to the public. We opened with heavy rains and floods, decent isolation measures because of the Omicron wave, and pretty short-staffed because of that. But we were bringing people together again with programming that was free for all to enjoy on the 12th of March to the 13th of June, 2022. And this was one of the first cultural events, certainly in this country, to open from the 2 years of lockdown. So it felt pretty good. Jose?
Thank you, Barb.
Over to you.
I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so Rivus, the 23rd Biennale of Sydney. When I was invited to submit a proposal, I had been working for 10 years running Flora, which is a space in Bogota for art and nature based on short-term residencies on a river. And I thought that could be sort of the basis for my proposal. So I pitched this idea to the Biennale selection team, and I was selected. I also proposed that I wouldn't do it by myself, but I would work with curators based in Sydney and associated with the institutions that traditionally worked with the Biennale. Until then, these institutions like the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Art Space, or the MCA had participated in the Biennale, hosting parts of it, but they never were part of the curatorial process. So I thought it was important to have their voice in the curatorium. So we put together this team, and we worked on my proposal that was originally called Weaving Water, and it dealt with the rivers and other bodies of water and the ecologies they sustained, with an important focus on material culture as a way to bring on the communities that live off the rivers. But of course, once I started working with the team, this idea changed, and we ended up with this project, Rivus, which you might know is the Latin root for a brook or stream or irrigation channel, but also the root for the word rivalry. So this idea of water and conflict is at the core of the project. But during our process, many other themes came up, like, for example, the rights of nature or the voices of nature, all the legal implications of having of a river having a legal presence, stories of creation from different First Nations worldwide, ideas like assembled ecosystems and collaboration between species, and so on. And particularly the idea of how to decenter the human and not having the human as the core of everything. So even though the title reflects this idea of the river, it was not biennial about the river, but rather about this delta of other themes that we sort of developed over the course of the process. So the idea of rivers having rights was also very important. So we invited several rivers and other bodies of water as participants in the Biennale, and they were represented by the ancestral custodians or people associated with them worldwide. The Biennale was displayed alongside a river, the Parramatta River, which is the main river in Sydney. It's actually more of an estuary, we wanted the exhibition to be clustered near the water and having the venues very near each other. So this is the Parramatta, and that goes into the harbor. And all of the venues were close together within walking distance. So the Cutaway, and I will speak more about it, was one of them. Then one of the piers on the water, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and the National Art School in partnership with Art Space. So they were all between 10 to 20 minutes walking distance, which created a more compact Biennale. And also in terms of the experience of the viewer, it was more enjoyable, I think. And these venues were not just venues where an exhibition that was curated as a whole was displayed, but rather each one of those venues was a territory in itself, a conceptual territory that we called a wetland. So each one of these wetlands had one or several themes being developed, like primal waters and deep time at the MCA, or the idea of rewilding and caring for country at the art gallery, and so on and so forth. So the main venue in terms of the quantity of artists and in general the scale of the project was the Cutaway at Barangaroo. It was a former like an industrial space that was turned into a mountain, and inside of it it was empty. So we decided to use it, which posed a lot of challenges because of the scale of the space. It rains inside, it shines. There are gusts of wind. So it was a really challenging space to work with, but I think it was also an interesting one because of that. Um, so I'm going to show some of the projects that we presented so you have an idea of how the Biennale looked like. So Cave Urban, so we were faced with this problem of having this enormous space. We enlisted Cave Urban, which are a collective from Australia, architects really, and they came up with this idea of creating a flowing river of bamboo. They are known for their buildings in bamboo. We provided them with a plan of how we envisioned the different works in this space, and they created something that took into account what we were showing there, and they created this very beautiful piece in bamboo, one of the largest structures in bamboo in the world, I would say, that snaked around the other works in the Biennale, creating pockets of space for them, and thus lowering the scale for the viewer. Otherwise, everything would look like in a hangar. It swirled around this ladder and then disappeared into the void. So it was a very, very successful piece in terms of how what it did for the Biennale, and I think it became also in a way an image of this Biennale Rivus. We had many projects from all around the world that dealt with ecologies associated with rivers and wetlands, like Ana Teresa Barbosa and Rafael Freire, an artist and weaver and an architect from Peru, who created this very beautiful piece, which is woven in reeds taken from a wetland, and they create the shape of the wetland, and the piece in itself works like a wetland in the sense that it is filtering water. So this is a previous incarnation of the piece, and this installation performed the role that wetlands have in filtering water in the environment. Tania Candiani from Mexico created a very beautiful piece. It's a sort of a branch, but it's also a river, and it's very much the two of it because these branches were washed ashore by a river in Mexico. They were assembled, creating this large-scale structure, which had an archive of migrating birds in Australia. And also, they had these clay pipes that were activated by air, compressed air, creating a pattern where the sounds of the migrating birds and these ocarinas were moving from branch to branch. And we were interested in having the voices of nature, and we thought that this piece, The Great Animal Orchestra by Bernie Krause and United Visual Artists, was perfect. This is a piece that had been shown in several places before, but never in Australia. And as you might know, it's the result of 50 years of field recordings by Bernie Krause, a bioacoustician, that it's in a way a chronicle of how nature sounds and how it used to sound and doesn't sound anymore. So it is at the same time a striking piece where these sonograms translate sound into visuals. It's very beautiful, contemplative piece, but it's also heartbreaking in the sense of it makes palpable how we are depleting our environment. And we had this piece as a public presentation projected on the sails of the Sydney Opera House. So it was a presence beyond the exhibition in a closed space. We had artists that did projects linked with local traditions, like Juliana Góngora from Colombia, who developed a way to weave, to create a thread out of milk. And with this milk thread, she was able to weave this very beautiful piece, which is an homage to her grandfather in the form of a tomb that was slowly decaying, placed in a pool of lime and water um, that dealt with the issues of the body in relation to the stars and healing. Uh, Also, we thought of different instances where um, uh, there is a sort of recuperation of tradition in a contemporary way. So we focused in canoe making in Australia with several projects where artists, most of them First Nation, are looking at documents, some from colonial times, in trying to recover or reclaim the traditions that have been lost due to colonization. So we had different types of reed and paperback canoes by Rex and Dean Greeno that were done based on historical descriptions because the knowledge had been lost, or Uncle Badger Bates in the foreground that created the first bark canoe to be floated in the Darling Barca River in 70 years, or Uncle John Kelly and Rena Shane, who did a community-based project uh, with a community dealing with a particular creation history. And we wanted to have some kind of continuity with the previous Biennale, because the traditional way of doing Biennales is that the new curator or artistic director comes up with a new idea and it's like a clean slate. But in many cases, community-based projects that were initiated in a Biennale are in a way orphaned after the Biennale ends. So we thought we could give continuity to some projects from the previous Biennale, and this one, the Ilya Nyara Many Hands Art Center near Alice Springs is one of them. So they are known by painting landscapes in the tradition of Albert Namatjira, a very well-known Aboriginal painter in Australia. But they had been doing this new project using discarded traffic signs and changing this signage in order to talk about caring for country. So we presented a group of these very beautiful paintings that dealt with protection of their territory from extractive industries. It is very difficult to try to sum up a very complex Biennale. I'm just showing some of the more salient works. Akron and Harvey, we invited them because of the work that they had done with the acorns that fell from Joseph Boy's famous work, 7,000 Oaks. They took the acorns and germinated them. And we wanted to deal with this project because one of those, let's say, one of the iterations of that work was done in Sydney as part of one of the biennales. So there is a tree, one of the boys' tree outside of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And we wanted this to be the point of departure for an entire wetland at the art gallery that dealt with these issues that were put forward by the Joseph Boys. So we invited Akron and Harvey. They, of course, you cannot enter a tree into Australia, but they are known by their portraits done in grass. So they did this two very beautiful, tall, 5 meter tall standing portraits of Uncle Chica Madden and Lil Madden, both Aboriginal environmental defenders. And in this building that it's the epitome of the colonial project installed in this Aboriginal land, building that has the names of the most important Western artists, most of them males, on the facade. The presence of these two tall figures done in grass was like a poignant presence that deconstructed the implications of this colonial building. Marjetica Potric from Slovenia collaborated with Uncle Ray Woods on this project about rights of nature, but also how to oppose the construction of a dam. And she created her signature large-scale wall paintings that tell stories about the struggle of different communities, in this case against the raising of a dam, the Loughlin Dam, and the house of the agreement between humans and the earth, which is an iteration of a previous work that she had done at Flora with us some years ago. Or Sian Derit, who did his very beautiful tapestries, also around opposition to dams, in this case in Philippines. Or Robert Andrew, who created this very, very powerful machine that was eroding slowly the walls by throwing a jet of water that was peeling away this whitewash on the wall, revealing the ochre behind, which is a very, very beautiful and powerful reflection on how the Aboriginal presence has been whitened out in this country. So little by little, it revealed two words that were given to him by his elders. Or Joy Holder, who created this very, very powerful, immersive environment. It is a sort of a fiction of a lake at the bottom of the ocean with these strange creatures that pounce at you. But we not only had artists, we had objects like this fish fossil, which chronicles a moment in time in the Devonian, also called the Age of Fishes, where our primitive ancestors were starting to crawl in this continent. Or projects that weren't even art. This is a project by the Sydney Institute of Marine Science that is meant to create a safe environment for marine life to cling to. So it's really an environmental project as opposed to an art project. And we presented it with a video that shows it being used in the Sydney Harbor. We had a very, very intense education and learning program led by Leah Smith in a place we call the Waterhouse. But in fact, the Waterhouse, which was a concept, was more program than space. It did have a space during the Biennale, but we started a year before creating and nurturing a public for the Biennale. So we had almost 400 public programs. Many of them had to do with understanding the distance between the venues, us, and a space to be activated. Many of them were to highlight the fact that you could do things after so many months or years of virtuality. I don't know, Barbie, if you want to add something.
I think you're on a roll. Go for it, Jose. It's fine.
Okay, perfect. So that's what the Biennale was about. but how it was put together is equally important. So I will briefly talk about that. So I decided, as Barb said, to move to Sydney for the entire duration of a process, not only as a gesture of total commitment, but also because the only way to lower your carbon footprint is to become local, or as local as possible. So I stayed there for the entire duration of the curatorial process. I worked with a team of local curators, and I told them that so many years of being traveling around should amount to something. So we decided not to travel, and this is before COVID. Afterwards, we couldn't travel anyway, but the idea was that we wouldn't travel, that we would consider 20 years of traveling, in my case, for art, as the travels for the Biennale, and we would continue existing conversations with artists and other practitioners from all around the world. So people that for me were very familiar projects, for them would be new, and the same for me. So it really worked well. That the idea was also to build upon what's already there. So continue existing conversations, providing the opportunity for existing projects to crystallize for the Biennale, as opposed to asking a very well-known artist to do a project based on the general theme that we were proposing. We wanted to grant continuity to some of the projects, and we ensured that there was a high degree of collaboration with other institutions around Australia. And there will be 4 institutions next year that will host parts of the Biennale. In terms of putting together the exhibition, well, we decided to reduce air travel whenever possible and reduce freight by doing local production or reproduction whenever possible. We took great measures, and the Biennale had already started this, to reduce waste by doing local dispersal after the Biennale ended, recycling, repurposing, or donating locally, having as little as museographical intervention as possible. We wanted to go down in history as the Biennale that didn't build a single wall. That wasn't possible in the end, but we did um, build very few walls, and all with scaffolding that could be taken apart afterwards, and only cladding the surface that would receive the art and not the rest. We used sustainable and non-polluting materials and processes, and we encouraged the artists to do the same whenever possible. And in some cases, we thought of the materials as projects in themselves, as I will show. So we launched a new and sustainable materials challenge with Cicada Innovations and the British Council, trying to identify new materials that weren't that could replace the traditional materials that are used in exhibition design. And I think we weren't that successful. Most of them were only in research phase, and not they weren't able to produce at the scale needed for a large exhibition. But I think it was interesting nonetheless. Like Jesse French, who is trying to re-signify the word plastic by creating bioplastics out of algae. And we had this laboratory setting inside the cutaway, where she was constantly producing this very beautiful plastic sheets of plastic done with algae. Um, we even use them to dim natural light in other venues. Or Diana Scherer, who has developed a way to coax the roots of grasses into weaving themselves into particular patterns. So it's truly a case of interspecies collaboration. So these are woven by the roots of the grasses themselves. She created this very beautiful pattern for us, and so we were growing these textiles in place, and every now and then we would put them to dry and create a new one. So those are the remnants of the Biennale, of that piece. And the publication, we thought that the catalog would be online, would be the website that can better represent with video and sound the exhibition itself. So that left us with the possibility of creating a project in itself. It's called the Glossary of Water, and it's printed entirely on repurposed paper stock that was left over from other print jobs. And it resembles, when seen from the side, the sedimentary layers of a river. And it is organized like a dictionary or a glossary with words that opened up the issues that we dealt with in the curating process of the Biennale. So I think that's all that I had to say for today. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thanks, Jose. All right, I'll do a quick wrap up before I hand over. Just a couple more things to show you kind of the overview of the exhibition, not from the art side, but kind of the stats side, to give you an idea of scale, you know, because it's like there are a lot of biennales around the world. So where does this all fit in? So just bear with. There you go. So the very quick wrap up, reporting is underway. We're working on that. We just closed in June. So by the end of July, we'll be at a closer place of being able to make a lot of this quite public, but we're doing it in this format. So, you know, the physical visitation in the end of this edition was 606,000 visitors, you know, 330 artworks, 62 new commissions, ton of arts and experiences, 400. That gives you an idea of the First Nations participation. If you're looking at individuals, it's like 68 individuals, but 32 kind of collectives counted as one.
Like a third.
Yeah, a third. More than a third, actually. But 277 media stories published across print, radio, TV, including 42 of which is international. On the physical visitation, there's 3 million digital direct engagement, 1.7 of which is just social media, people looking at videos and stuff. Now, why was this Biennale of Sydney successful in our books? You know, I just want to reflect on the fact that the Biennale of Sydney really embraces and leans into that agility and creativity, that it's our job to get people out of their comfort zones, to come together, to learn from each other and embrace our differences, artists and audiences included. So just noting that provocation, that inspiration, that enticing, getting people together, imagining a better future together was absolutely achieved from this Biennale, that artists are completely at the center of what we do. And it's from our roots, that love for the participants' practice, the thinkers, the movers, and commissioning their work was a really important place to start. So this exhibition was so much about the feeling, the physical experience of coming together, and actually push back against kind of hybrid events, very, very physical intentionally for 2022. And that the purpose of the Biennale of Sydney is to be looking forward and looking around at the same time. I'm going to end on the fact that, you know, any organization is about its people. So thinking that there are 89 participants, full delivery of the Biennale involves 403 casuals, employees, contractors, volunteers. In addition to that, there's the plethora of, you know, there's the board, partners, patrons, all involved to deliver the Biennale of Sydney exhibition across 7 locations. We mentioned that we consider that those museums and galleries have their own teams that lean in, produce, present the exhibition within their own space as well. And then that has now distilled down to the core team of 19 people who are on board to report and deliver the next edition of the Biennale of Sydney. And I'll just do another shout out to Jose and just say how incredible it's been to do this Biennale with him, and how much it really is about the people and the relationship and trust and doing something together. That's the real joy of it, isn't it, for all of us? Questions? Love your work, Jose. Deep respect.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Jose. I join your last shout outs, and I think I extended to your work. I think both of you, gave us a great view of something that feels like really a complex and diversified project, and a project that really managed. And I was reading a lot about it, both through some of the articles that you mentioned that were published, but also through the sites and so on before this event. And I think hearing from you some of the behind the curtains information and some of the thinking behind it really gave a sense of what kind of complex thinking there was behind or in approaching this idea of Rivus, which, as you mentioned, is both river but also conflict, and I think that emerged in a very powerful way through the presentation. So thank you both very much for the presentation and for the Biennial, which I didn't have the luck to see, but I feel after seeing the presentation that I can say a little bit more about, and I can develop a few more thoughts about. I want to remind everyone that for the Q&A session, you're more than welcome to turn on your camera. Please don't turn on your mic as well, because otherwise it will be problematic, but I'm more than happy to give you the word for any questions that you have. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat to send a question either to myself or to the International Biennial Association person that you can select in the in the Zoom app. I wanted to start off with a few questions, and I have to say that I was positively impressed that I don't have to ask some of the questions that I wanted to ask. Starting with one of the last thing that Jose went through, which is the description of the ways in which the Biennial was able to maintain a low carbon footprint, and the ways that you worked towards not just being aware about this problem, but actively working towards that. And I think that's something that is part of a long discussion within the general or with the global biennial community. And I think it's great to see an example of how this can come together and not limit the extent of a show itself, and actually be part of it and produce quite beautiful results, I would say. Quite beautiful and important results. On the other hand, though, not on the other hand, but following from that, one of the things that Barbara mentioned that is particularly important for the Biennale of Sydney is the attention and the relationship with First Nation communities and with Aboriginal communities. And so this is a question directly for Jose, who had to encounter all of this world. And given also that you are working with a curatorial team, who I also would like to thank at this moment for their work, I was wondering how you and them, or you through them, I guess, and through the institution directly, developed this relationship and were able to not just include them, as Barb said at the introduction, not just for the sake of including them, but really to make them part of the project. You mentioned a few works that included Aboriginal artists and First Nation artists, but I was wondering really from your perspective how this encounter happened and how you were able to make it part of the project.
I had worked with some Aboriginal artists myself here in Colombia and elsewhere. but I was really impressed with the degree of care that Australia has in terms of the cultural protocols when approaching First Nation practitioners. So we were a team of 5. 3 of us would be more, let's say, traditional type of curators, but 2 were not. Pascal Dantosberry, who I included mainly because he was at that time the education and learning person at the Biennale. So I wanted to have the education component built in the curatorial project and not having it afterwards. Pascal then moved to the art gallery, so he became the curator from the art gallery in the team. But the more important point here is that he is mainly a curator that works with communities in long-term projects. So he was able to bring that knowledge to the team. It really worked very well. Many of those projects, like the canoe making project, has started years before. Rina Shane and Uncle John Kelly's project was meant to be for the previous Biennale, and it didn't happen for different reasons. So we had many projects that were ongoing projects in Sydney already that we were able to include because of Pascal's knowledge and long-term, let's say, history of working with these communities. And we had Hannah Donnelly, who is a First Nations producer at Information and Cultural Exchange, now renamed Arts and Cultural Exchange in Parramatta, which is in Western Sydney, a more, let's say, developing working class neighborhood. And she was able to provide the team with her knowledge about protocols when working with Aboriginal practitioners. So that ensured that we were on the right track, because I, for one, didn't know Australia at all, the Australian scene, and even less so the Aboriginal scene, which is it's a very complex issue that we don't have time to delve into right now. But it's really complex, the very notion of Aboriginal art when seen from a Western perspective. So I would say I tapped on everybody's knowledge and previous experience in order to steer the project in the right direction. And I think I mean, I think we did well in most cases, I would say, or in all of them, if I'm allowed. Barb,
Barbara, you want to add something
yeah,
from your
maybe
perspective?
about this cultural awareness training that we had with the
Yeah,
Australia Council.
I'd say there's definite training for everybody involved, and good materials out there now developed to give guidance to people on cultural protocols and how to work with First Nations communities generally in the arts, developed by Australia Council, our national funding body. But then also within the organization, important to provide support at all levels of decision making, so it doesn't come down to one individual, but from a creative perspective, representation board, executive leadership team, all of that, to ensure that it doesn't come down to a single individual who's responsible for carrying that or providing introductions. It's probably as much as I could add at this point.
Before going on with my ramblings and my other questions, Alia just wrote, Alia Svastika from Yogyakarta just wrote a question in the chat, but I want to ask her if she wants to join and say the question herself. Otherwise, I can go ahead and read it. Alia, can you hear it?
Okay. Yeah, I'm reading it right now. Sorry.
So I'll just read it so that we have it also on voice. How do you think the model of involving more artists from First Nation or indigenous communities around the world would offer a possibility of decolonizing biennales? How the Biennale of Sydney in the future would like to be connected with other biennials that support similar vision of working with indigenous communities? Thank you for the question, Alia. Yes, she's not just living in Jogja, but also a member of the Jogja Biennale, or Biennale Jogja. Sorry.
Can I answer this in two ways? One, I'm open to knowledge sharing and us connecting and just continuing to talk. It's why I'm involved with IBA, and I think yeah, sharing learned experiences, it's a way that we can all develop a little bit faster than just relying on our own experience within our own regions. So we need to keep talking. It's probably a bit abstract, but not a tangible outcome necessarily beyond, co-commissioning together, co-presenting, and on that decolonizing thing, future Biennale of Sydney, there's a lot to be learned. Something that Hannah Donnelly, who Jose mentioned on the curatorium, said at the beginning of this exhibition when she became involved. She said, there are a lot of stories and knowledge from First Nations people that we can all learn from. And she felt like at the time it was finally a safe time to share them in this place. And that idea, there are a lot of things about like First Nations leadership and collectivity and collaboration and that type of thing that completely changes the power dynamic of how organizations operate. And I just suggest that's largely how we need to lean into that kind of change. It's not something that happens overnight, but how decisions are made and what kind of program we do is the best answer I can give to your question. And thank you for that. Good to see you.
Maybe building on that question and trying to balance questions for Jose and for you. I can follow up a little bit, and because it's something that I had thought about already when you were talking and narrating your own trajectory within the Biennial. And you came to be the director of the Biennial, I think, in a quite crucial moment, also institutionally. Things happened beforehand, and I'm not specifically talking about the pandemic, but more of an institutional shift altogether that the Biennial experienced, let's say. And I'm saying this with the knowledge of having had Brooke Andrew here talking about his Biennial just a year ago when he presented his project and his account of what it was like and the institutional work that also he had to do. And so maybe I can ask you a bit more specifically about the ways in which the Biennial changed also institutionally in the last few years, and what that was like for the institution and for the curators and artists that participate in it.
Yeah, maybe Barb can start and I can offer my own perspective.
Yeah, so Brooke at the IBA forum, he spoke about cultural safety quite a bit. And I just say, look, Brooke came in as an artist, as a pushing First Nations-led, artist-led provocation. It takes somebody to be a forerunner. And if you look at the content of his exhibition and embracing edge and marginalized and overlooked communities, whatever that may be, it took him to kind of punch us in the face with something that we hadn't been paying attention to, right? So imagine his exhibition is like a, come on, pay attention. There's something going on and you're all missing it, confrontational in that way, in a beautiful way. And then following that, you have Jose Roca, who almost makes it this, let's seduce them with the beauty. Yeah, it's like attract them with the aesthetic. And then the concept, he's talking about Great Animal Orchestra in that way, like this beautiful thing, luscious thing that pulls you in. And then there's a really, really deep message, this thing that we all need to figure out and pay attention to. And imagine the next one, maybe now that we've been punched and seduced, maybe it's actually leaning into the celebration and the joy of all of this. Yeah, that's probably enough for me.
In my case, I was very aware that I was entering a space that had been sort of opened by Brooks Biennale, of course, by the other Biennales, but I think Brooks in particular was a paradigm shift. So I tried to be aware in all the decisions that I took by working collectively, trying to be local, trying to acknowledge what is already there as ways of decolonizing a model that can be very, very sort of, let's say, dismissive of what has been built so far. So that was my own way of dealing with it. This Biennale was also done under duress because when I was chosen, when I proposed the project and when I was chosen, COVID didn't exist. Then it became a thing, and then it became a reality. And so this Biennale was maybe the first of one of the first large-scale events to be done within the time of COVID because, as I said, COVID started when I was selected, and then the restrictions eased just a few weeks before the opening. So we had to imagine a way of working together under that situation. My move to Australia had to be pushed until the country finally accepted me, and I was able to enter with my wife. We built a life there for almost 2 years that involved becoming as local in many senses. You know, getting to know the city, getting to know the artistic scene as much as I could. But of course, there were lockdowns all the time. You know, so I was also experiencing the impossibility of meeting with people that were just a few blocks away. So as an experience so I think that is why maybe there is so much materiality and craft in this biennial. Maybe to counter all this time of virtuality, we ended up having so much work that is about the materials, the materiality. Many of it was works that were done as the result of a collaboration between a human and non-human. Many of the works were living and dying. Many works disappeared during the Biennale, the duration of the Biennale, and were degraded by the elements. So all that was a way for us to, in a way, let's say decolonize is a word that is brandished too much. Let's say deconstruct or softly deconstruct some of the tenets of biennials, which are materiality, I mean, the object, the precious art object, the ownership and authorship, and all that was put into question by these different practices that were about, you know, other issues.
I have many more questions, but I also want to respect the fact that we're on different time zones, and especially for Jose, it's quite late in the evening. So I think I want to just
It's already
with
5 o'clock in the morning. So when we started, it was 4 in the morning. That is why you know, my brain took a little time to.
Thank you so much for the effort. We really, really appreciate it. And as said, even more reason to keep it short. But I want to finish with I mean, as said, I would like to ask Barbara about what she mentioned about provocations or the biennial as a provocation and how this is received by the institutions that you work with. I would like to ask Jose how this whole pandemic situation what it meant within this pandemic situation to actually work with artists, not just locally. And you said you make an effort to be local, but you were working with artists in other parts of the world. So how that turned out. But to keep it short, I want to conclude with one maybe odd and very brief question, because in your introduction, Barbara, you mentioned, or you said that the biennial was something joyous to look forward to at the end of the COVID tunnel, which I think we all appreciate very much, not just in the case of the Biennale of Sydney, but in all of the beautiful events that actually could take place this year. But looking a bit online on the sites, I came across this, I don't know how big or small the project was, but very beautifully named project at least, which was the Lockdown Love series. Just as an example, I think, of what can happen online, what can happen offline, the ways in which the Biennial also multiplied itself to accommodate these limits. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this, because it was one of the things that I came across that I said, okay, this is another way of dealing with locality, but at a distance, let's say. It felt very close, very intimate, but it was done from a distance. So I just want to ask you this as a final question, and to both of you, I guess, somehow.
Jose, do you want to go first?
Well, as I said, this was a situation where I was there, but sometimes I couldn't be actually out because we were in lockdown. So I think that the fact that I proposed to my team that we would consider existing conversations as one of the cores of the Biennale meant that we had like a deep knowledge of many of the participants that we were including. And I say participants because not all of them were artists. Many were, people from communities, architects, designers, and rivers, as I mentioned. So we had already a sort of intimacy with many of them, which meant that there was something to start from. So once we had selected the list of participants for the Biennale, we met with each one of them and we did a presentation of the Biennale for each one of them. So we did 100 presentations basically, and with all of the curatorial team present and the production team, so that the participant understood the context in which their work would be included, and then at least two of us would continue that conversation till the end. So that's a way to establish, I think, a meaningful conversation. And your other question about how we interacted with the institutions, I think it really worked well because the curators were associated with these institutions, but I made it a point that we would curate collectively. So it wasn't like, for example, there is an exhibition in Sydney called The National, where 3 curators associated with different institutions curate a show, but each one of them curates their own part of the show. And then The National is the total of that. I didn't want that. I wanted us to be responsible for the entire project. And then we collectively decided which works would go to the art gallery, not Pascal, who works there, or at the MCA, not Anna, who works there. That meant that we could claim an ownership, intellectual ownership of the entire Biennale, and not just cut it in pieces. But by the same token, the curator that worked at that particular venue, when it came to installation, was a sort of project manager, was really on top of it. So it was, I would say, more seamless than if the Biennale would arrive, you know, with a part of the Biennale to be installed there. So I think that worked really well. And I would say that I don't know about the previous incarnations of the Biennale because I wasn't there, and probably Barbara won't say, but I would think that this Biennale was a more harmonic integration between the Biennale and the institutional venues than previous editions, just because, you know, they were deeply implicated in the project.
In classic, I'll respond in a completely different way, but I hear you. Jose, let me start by just saying this exhibition, this Biennale, not even just exhibition, but thinking of the exhibition, the Biennale, as a holistic thing, you know, exhibition, public programs. This edition really leaned into the experience. So if it's online, you know, who the audience member is and what we can provide specific to that that moment or type of engagement that'll actually feel good and provide an entryway where somebody can actually engage more deeply with something we leaned into, right? So there's a certain amount of care and attention to our audience. So it meant, yes, Kristen, you were talking about the kind of online type stuff. The intimacy in that was thinking through, okay, what will actually shift something inside of somebody, make them feel something and engage with it rather than just glance at it or walk past it. So the manifestation of that program, it was quite different digitally than it is in a physical experience, quite different for a student, quite different for a kid and their family than it is for, you know, a corporate sponsor or somebody really well versed in art. The intention was not like this plethora, but doing things really intentionally with the consideration of care. And as a wrap up, I have to give a lot of credit to the Biennale of Sydney team. You know, never have I ever worked with people that are just so passionate about something and aligned. An organization we often forget are actually just people all doing something along a common good. So again, that concept of collective leadership, you know, I play a part and I am one gear in this, whatever, imagine it as a watch, and it only works when the whole thing is spinning. And I hugely value what everybody has put into leaning into that care for country, care for environment, conscientiousness of exhibition making. And that includes Jose. It's enough for me.
I think that's a very beautiful way to come to a conclusion of the presentation. Before leaving you all, I want to again thank you both and everybody else that contributed to Rivus and to the 23rd Sydney Biennial. Or Biennale of Sydney, I should say. We really look forward to seeing what this celebration that you mentioned would look like in 2 years' time. Yeah, we wish you both wonderful things for the future. I also want to quickly remind everyone to keep track of our next events through our social media, through our website, and through the newsletter and all the other channels that we use usually to communicate with you all. And yeah, I think I just want to thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.